Hello and welcome to PR Clip. My name is Talia, and in the last lesson we learned how to utilize events and use colliders. In today's lesson we are going to learn about user interface or UI. You will need the following resources: Unity, preferably a later version. I'll be using version 22.3, and a computer. So today our goal is to make a canvas, add buttons, and then we're going to make a cube change color and size whenever you press the corresponding button. So as you can see here, I've opened up Unity Hub, and the first thing we're going to do is create a new project. So I'm going to use the 3D one, and then I'll be naming it UI Basics, but you can name it whatever you want. So we create the project. And it'll take a while for it to load, so I'll just cut to that. Welcome back. So now that we have our project up and running, the first thing that we're going to do is to create our canvas. So we're going to right click on the hierarchy, go to UI, and then scroll down to our canvas. And now, as you can see, we have a canvas. Next thing that we're going to do is change the render mode to world space. This is just going to make sure that we can see both the canvas and the object that we're going to create. And for our event camera, we'll just choose our main camera. Now that I can edit the dimensions in the Rect Transform area, I'm going to make it a little bit smaller and easier to see. So we're going to change the width and height to 200. I'm going to set the X value to 0 and the Y value to 100. And as you can see, we have a canvas there. The next thing I'm going to do is give it a more opaque background. So if we go to Add Component, and we can look up Image, it will make the background white. However, I think I'm going to change the color to black just to make it a little bit easier to see. And if we go to our game, we can see that the canvas is showing up on our camera. If your camera is not at the right position, you can change it. So I set the Y equal to 100 and the Z equal to -250, and that seemed to work pretty well for me. So the next thing I'm going to want to do is to add our cube. So I'm going to go to 3D Object, select Cube, and I'm going to again center it. And if we go into game, we can see that it's pretty tiny, so I'm just going to scale it up by 10. Great. So now that we have our cube and our canvas, the next thing that we are going to do is to create a button. So we're going to go into UI again, and then scroll down to button. And it might prompt you to download TMP Essentials, so you can go ahead and do that. I'm going to first rename my button. I like to rename the elements in my project into things that make sense for what their function. So since this one is going to be changing the color of our cube, I'm going to rename it as Change Color. And then I also want to resize it. So we can go into Rect Transform here and position it and change the dimensions as we want. So I'm going to go ahead and make the width a little bit smaller and the height a little bit smaller. The next thing that I want to do is change what it says. I don't want all of my buttons to say buttons, so we're going to open this drop down here, go into Text TMP, and then change that under the text input. So I want this to say Change Color because that's what it does. However, you may have noticed another issue. The text is running over the lines. In order to fix this, I'm just going to come down here under Main Settings and click on Auto Size. And I can then adjust the minimum and maximum to my preference, and it will automatically fit itself to the size. The next thing that I'm going to come and do is change the margins. If we go into Extra Settings, we see that we have this option to change the margins. And I'm going to go ahead and do that because I don't really like how it's touching the edges of the buttons. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a left and right margin and then a bottom margin. So there we go. We have our first button. In order to save some effort, I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate that because most of the settings are the same. And then I'm just going to differentiate it by changing its name. So since this one is going to be the one that changes the size, I'm going to go ahead and name it Change Size, and we're going to move it down so that it doesn't cover our original button. Next thing I'm going to go ahead and do is again change that text. So instead of change color, I want it to say Change Size. We can also do some other cool stuff with the buttons. If we go back to our button, we can see that under image, we could change the color. I'm gonna go ahead and leave it at white for now. And you can also change what happens when you hover over it or press it, etc. So these are some ways that you can have fun with that. I would definitely encourage you to experiment more with what you can do with the UI system in Unity. Great, so now that we have all of our elements, the next thing that we're going to want to do is write our code. So we're going to go ahead and go to our cube. I'm going to click on Add Component, and then I'm going to create a new script. Let's name it Change Cube because that's what we're doing. And then go ahead and click Create and Add. So the next thing I'm going to do is just open that up and edit it, and then I'll probably cut back to that so you can see because it might take a bit to load. Okay, so now that our script is finished loading, we can go ahead and delete all of these default functions that they add for us. The first method that I'm going to create is the one that changes the color of the cube. So we're going to go ahead and write our function by doing public void and then change cube. Go ahead and give it a parameter. That parameter is going to represent any object we want it to, but in this case, it would be the cube we made earlier. So in case you're ever wondering, the public just means that it's referenced, that it can be referenced outside of the class, and the void just means that there is no return value. I see that I accidentally named it change cube. So we can go ahead and fix that to change color. Next thing I'm going to do is add a comment saying what this function does, because it's always just a good idea to document your code in case someone else is looking at it. So changes color of cube to a random color. Great. So the next thing I'm going to do is make a renderer variable, and we're just going to go ahead and set that equal to the renderer of whatever parameter we have. So cube.getComponent and then renderer. And then we're going to try and change the color now. So we're going to reference that renderer we just created, .material, and then .color. And we're going to go ahead and set that equal to a new color. And we'll just make it a random color by giving it 3 random RGB values. Okay, so now whenever we call this function with the parameter that we give it, it will change whatever that parameter, whatever that object is to a random color. So the second function we're going to create is the one that changes the size. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing, but I'm going to rename it change size. And again, give it a parameter of cube. And then I'm again going to comment and just say what it does. So the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do is create a random variable. So this is going to be a float, and this will represent the dimensions of my newly sized cube. I'm just going to go ahead and give that variable a name of random size and set it equal to any number in between the range of, let's say, 5 and 20. The next thing we're going to do is just go ahead and reference our object and then transform and local scale. So this will just change the dimensions of our cube. And then I'm going to go ahead and set that equal to a new vector 3 for the 3 dimensions. And we're going to make all 3 of the values random size so that it stays a cube. So that's all the coding we have to do for this project. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And then we can go back to our Unity screen, our project. Great, so now we are back. So now that we have everything that we need, we're just going to go ahead and make the buttons do what we want them to do. So if we click on our change color button and scroll down to this button drop down, you'll see that in this area there's a place called on click. And this just means that whenever you click on this, it will run whatever functions or methods that you have in here. So I'm going to go ahead and add our function that we just created. As our object, we're going to put cube because that is the object that has the script that we just created. And as our function, we're going to go ahead and reference change cube, which is the script that we just created. And this is a space for a parameter. And since we want it to change the cube's color, we're going to go ahead and put that in there. You may have noticed that I'm interchangeably referencing methods and functions, and that's just because they are the same thing. So we're going to do the same thing with our change size function. So we are going to put cube as the object, change cube, and then change size, because this is our change size button. And then again, just go ahead and put cube as the game object. And there we go. I'm going to go ahead and save my changes and then we can test it out. So if we click on play here, as you can see, we can go ahead and change the color of what the cube is, and we can also change the size of the cube. So that is it for this tutorial. I hope you learned something today. If you are looking for some more resources, there is a lot of stuff on Unity Learn. So one article that I found kind of helpful was working with UI in Unity. In case you're having trouble debugging things, I find AI to be a really useful start. It's not always accurate, but I find that it gives me a pretty good idea of where I should start looking at. I would definitely encourage you to explore more with Unity UI. There's also ways to utilize buttons using listeners in C# script, so if you're interested in that, you can totally go check that out. You could also just try making a button that does something totally different than what we just did. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope to see you in our next tutorial on particles.